The ink had barely dried on the Geneva Agreements when the machinery of division began to turn. In the final days of July 1954, diplomats and military officers signed the agreement on the cessation of hostilities in Vietnam, a document that would reshape the lives of millions. The ceasefire granted 300 days for the regroupment of armed forces on either side of a new line drawn across the map of Vietnam. It was a line that would come to define a generation. That demarcation followed the Ben Hai River through Quang Tri Province, running close to the 17th parallel of latitude. On each side stretched a demilitarized zone extending roughly 5 kilometers, a buffer meant to separate two worlds that had once been one country, one people, one shared history. The agreement assigned political and administrative control in the northern regrouping zone to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, while the southern zone fell under the authority of the French Union and the state of Vietnam. French forces were required to withdraw southward across this line, while Viet Minh units scattered across the south were to regroup in the north. For civilians caught between these vast military movements, the accords promised freedom to cross from one zone to the other during that narrow window of 300 days. To oversee these momentous changes, an international commission for supervision and control was established. India would chair the commission, joined by Canada and Poland, 3 nations tasked with monitoring the ceasefire and the withdrawal of troops. Teams from the commission deployed to locations throughout Vietnam, stationing themselves in Hanoi and Saigon, in the port city of Haiphong, and along the sensitive areas near the 17th parallel. Their mandate was broad, encompassing the supervision of troop movements, the observance of ceasefire provisions, and the oversight of restrictions on foreign military personnel entering either zone. It was a task of considerable complexity, spread across a country still scarred by nearly a decade of war. The bulk of the Commission's monitoring work unfolded in the first several months following the agreement. Viet Minh units in the south began their long march northward almost immediately, moving toward assembly areas designated for their reception. Simultaneously, French Union forces initiated phased withdrawals from northern cities. Hanoi and Haiphong, which had served as centers of French military and administrative power for generations, gradually emptied of foreign troops as columns moved south toward bases in the newly defined southern zone or departed entirely for metropolitan France. The scale of these movements was staggering. French military sources later reported that approximately 95,000 French military personnel evacuated from the north during this period, accompanied by some 38,000 French civilians. In addition, nearly 59,000 Vietnamese soldiers affiliated with French forces made the journey southward. Moving in the opposite direction, roughly 100,000 Viet Minh fighters relocated from the south to the north, leaving behind the villages and provinces where they had fought for years. For many, it was a wrenching departure, a farewell to homes they believed they would soon return to once elections reunified the country. But the movement of soldiers was only part of the story. Civilians, too, began to move in numbers that would reshape the demographic landscape of Vietnam. The port city of Haiphong became the principal embarkation point for those heading south by sea, while Saigon and the nearby port of Vung Tau served as the main receiving centers. Ships of every description crowded the harbors, loading families with whatever possessions they could carry onto decks already packed with anxious faces. The United States Navy organized what became known as Operation Passage to Freedom, deploying Task Force 90 to assist French and State of Vietnam authorities in transporting Vietnamese civilians and military personnel from the north to the south. Between August 1954 and May 1955, American naval vessels and ships of the Military Sea Transportation Service carried approximately 310,000 people on this journey. In total, French and American sea and air evacuations moved about 800,000 people out of the north by the time the regroupment period ended in May 1955. Official figures recorded that around 768,000 migrants moved under military supervision, including some 190,000 soldiers and returned prisoners. Among these were military dependents, Nung auxiliaries who had served French forces, French civilians who had made their lives in Indochina, and ethnic Chinese residents who chose to leave the North for an uncertain future in the South. Later studies and commission summaries often cite a total north-to-south civilian migration ranging from 600,000 to 1 million people. The commission itself noted that at least 892,000 North Vietnamese were processed as migrants under the provisions related to movement between zones. Many of these migrants were Catholics who preferred not to live under the administration of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Entire parishes relocated together, priests leading their congregations southward toward a future they could only imagine. The movement was not without friction. Canadian representatives on the commission reported instances where North Vietnamese attempting to leave were hindered by local authorities and militias. Yet the 300-day window remained formally in place, and the majority of those who wished to move managed to do so before the deadline passed. Movement in the opposite direction, from south to north, was smaller in scale, but no less significant for those involved. Estimates suggest that between 14,000 and 45,000 civilians made the journey northward into territory administered by the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. These were primarily Viet Minh cadres, soldiers and their families, relocating from southern bases and cities to begin new lives in the revolutionary heartland. On both sides of the demarcation line, authorities scrambled to receive and resettle the arriving populations. In the north, the government established reception and resettlement arrangements for returning units and civilians. In the south, the state of Vietnam and French services set up transit camps and refugee facilities around Saigon, Tu Do Mot, Bien Hoa, and other localities to accommodate the flood of northerners. Tent cities sprouted in vacant lots and rice paddies, temporary shelters that would, for many, become semi-permanent homes. The commission continued its work throughout these months, but its role was fundamentally supervisory. It possessed no independent enforcement capability to compel compliance when violations occurred. Indian officers typically chaired local teams, while Canadian and Polish members sometimes filed separate or dissenting interpretations of alleged violations. Commission reports documented various complaints, including claims of continued Viet Minh presence in some southern areas and allegations of external military support flowing to both zones despite prohibitions. The demilitarized zone itself was intended as a buffer, forbidden territory that regular combat forces of neither side were to enter. Administratively, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam assumed control of Hanoi and Haiphong in late 1954 as French troops completed their scheduled withdrawals. In the south, Saigon emerged as the seat of the State of Vietnam government, overseeing administration below the 17th parallel. Both zones were prohibited by the accords from joining military alliances or inviting new foreign troops or bases onto their soil. In practice, commission reports and later analyses noted that both sides began developing external security relationships despite these restrictions. The 300 days of regroupment ended in May 1955, by which time the major military redeployments and most organized civilian movements had been completed. What had seemed like a temporary arrangement was beginning to take on the permanence of an accomplished fact. After regroupment, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam focused on consolidating state structures and military forces in the north, while the state of Vietnam pursued similar efforts in the south. The Commission remained in Vietnam beyond 1955, but its influence over political developments and preparations for elections proved limited. The Geneva Final Declaration had envisaged national elections in July 1956 to reunify Vietnam, but no joint all-Vietnam electoral arrangements materialized by that date. The elections that had seemed so certain in the summer of 1954 receded into the distance, first postponed, then ignored. By mid-1956, what had been intended as a provisional demarcation had effectively hardened into a long-term political and administrative division. The regroupment and migration processes of 1954 and 1955 had created large communities of displaced persons and resettled populations on each side of the 17th parallel. These communities would shape the social and political landscape of both zones for years to come, their presence a constant reminder of the partition that had torn Vietnam in two. On the 16th of June 1954, while the Geneva negotiations were still underway, a meeting took place in France that would alter the course of Vietnamese history. Diem, a Catholic nationalist who had spent years in exile, sat across from Bao Dai, the former emperor who now served as chief of state of the French Associated State of Vietnam. The two men reached an agreement. Diem would return to Vietnam as prime minister, but only if granted broad civil and military authority. It was a bargain that would give Diem the power he needed to reshape the South. 8 days later, on the 24th of June, Diem landed at Tan Son Nhut Airport in Saigon. He returned to a country on the brink of partition, a government weakened by years of war, and a political landscape crowded with rivals. 2 days after his arrival, on the 26th of June, Bao Dai formally appointed him prime minister, just weeks before the Geneva Accords would be concluded. Diem's appointment drew support from some American officials who viewed him as an anti-communist nationalist capable of building a viable non-communist regime in the South. But the challenges facing the new prime minister were immense. After Geneva, Diem's government had to contend with overlapping pressures from French military authorities still present in Vietnam, from Bao Dai's entourage, who retained influence over the chief of state, and from powerful, autonomous armed groups that controlled vast swaths of territory in and around Saigon. These armed groups presented the most immediate threat to central authority. The Binh Xuyen, a criminal political organization, dominated much of Saigon Cholan's underworld and had been entrusted with running the city's police. The religious sect armies of the Cao Dai and Hoa Hao controlled significant territories and revenue sources in the Mekong Delta and provinces west of the capital. French commanders in 1954 and 1955 sometimes favored maintaining the power of these groups as a counterweight to Diem, whom many French officials viewed with skepticism. But Diem moved quickly to assert control. In September and October of 1954, he began reorganizing the State of Vietnam Army, seeking officers loyal to his government rather than to French or sect interests. In January 1955, he dismissed General Nguyen Van Hinh, a pro-French chief of staff, significantly reducing French influence over the Vietnamese National Army. By early 1955, Diem's authority in Saigon was openly contested by the Binh Xuyen, which still controlled the national police and several security installations. Tensions escalated rapidly. On the 29th of March, 1955, Binh Xuyen forces attacked government positions in Saigon, including an assault near the presidential palace. French intervention briefly halted the fighting, but the underlying conflict remained unresolved. Just days earlier, on the 5th of March, the Binh Xuyen, Cao Dai, and Hua Hao had announced the formation of a united front of national forces, demanding Diem's resignation. The United Front sent representatives to Bao Dai requesting that he dismiss Diem and form a new government that would include the sects. But Diem refused to step down. He prepared the national army for a final confrontation with the Binh Xuyen, determined to break their hold on the capital. In April 1955, Diem ordered military operations against Binh Xuyen positions in Saigon Chalon. Government forces gradually pushed the Binh Xuyen out of the urban center and into the swampy areas of nearby Bien Hoa and Phuoc Thu provinces. By early May, Diem's troops had effectively broken the Binh Xuyen's organized presence in Saigon. The victory was decisive, a turning point that demonstrated Diem's willingness to use force against those who challenged his authority. Diem used a combination of military pressure and negotiation to reduce the power of certain Cao Dai and Hua Hao factions as well. On the 15th of May, he abolished Bao Dai's Imperial Guard, symbolically ending one of the chief of state's remaining independent power bases. The defeat of the Binh Xuyen and the weakening of the sect forces dramatically reduced French leverage in Saigon and strengthened Diem's position. American observers who had watched the crisis unfold with anxiety now saw Diem's victories as evidence of political strength and leadership capacity. On the 30th of April, a revolutionary council dominated by Cao Dai elements had publicly urged Diem to depose Bao Dai immediately. But Diem declined to remove the chief of state by decree, preferring instead to plan a popular referendum that would confer formal legitimacy on any change in leadership. American diplomats indicated that continued support for Diem would depend on his ability to secure legal, popular endorsement for replacing Bao Dai. In the summer of 1955, Diem created the Kun Lao Party, formerly known as the Personalist Labor Revolutionary Party, as an informal political apparatus to support his government. The Kung Lao network operated largely behind the scenes, integrating loyalists within the civil service, army, and provincial administrations. Diem also established the National Bank of Vietnam and other financial institutions to strengthen the state's economic autonomy, while his government increased control over the national police and internal security agencies. On the 7th of July 1955, Diem publicly rejected the Geneva timetable for all Vietnam elections in 1956, citing concerns about the possibility of free conditions in the North. His refusal to participate in nationwide elections would have lasting consequences for the division of Vietnam. In September 1955, Diem announced that a referendum would be held to decide whether Bao Dai should remain chief of state or be replaced by Diem as head of a new republic. The vote was scheduled for the 23rd of October. The referendum was organized under the supervision of Diem's government. Official campaign materials portrayed Diem favorably while criticizing Bao Dai as an absent and ineffective ruler who had spent too much time on the French Riviera. Voting took place across South Vietnam, including Saigon and provincial centers. The official results reported that Diem received about 98.2% of the vote, while Bao Dai received about 1.8%. In Saigon, official figures indicated that ballots for Diem exceeded the number of registered voters, suggesting significant irregularities in the counting process. Contemporary observers and later historians widely regard the 1955 referendum as heavily manipulated. Yet many also assess that Diem enjoyed substantial, genuine support at this moment, particularly among Catholic refugees and anti-communist nationalists. Following the referendum on the 26th of October 1955, Diem formally proclaimed the Republic of Vietnam, replacing the state of Vietnam that had existed since 1949. On the same date, he declared the monarchy abolished and Bao Dai deposed as chief of state. Diem assumed the office of president, becoming both head of state and head of government. A new constitution for the Republic of Vietnam was promulgated exactly 1 year later, on the 26th of October 1956. The constitution established a strong presidency, a national assembly, and a council of ministers, with significant executive authority concentrated in the president's hands. Diem's administration promoted a doctrine often referred to as personalism, influenced by the French Catholic philosopher Emmanuel Mounier and adapted to Vietnamese conditions by Diem's brother Ngo Dinh Nhu. The Con Lao Party was closely linked to the presidency and functioned as a ruling party, though it was not always formally acknowledged as such. Diem's brothers played key roles in the new regime. Ngo Dinh Nhu handled political organization and intelligence, while Ngo Dinh Khun exercised regional control in central Vietnam. In 1955 and 1956, the government undertook administrative reorganization, replacing many provincial and district officials associated with previous regimes or the defeated sects. Early land policies were initiated, including redistribution programs and revision of rents, though large-scale reform remained limited during this period. The United States government recognized Diem's Republic of Vietnam and continued to increase military and economic support after the abolition of the monarchy. American officials often described Diem as a key anti-communist ally in Southeast Asia. French influence in South Vietnam declined sharply after 1955, as Diem's consolidation of power reduced France's political role in the region. Some Vietnamese nationalists and opposition figures criticized Diem's concentration of power and the restrictive nature of political life under the new republic. His refusal to participate in nationwide elections in 1956 and his focus on building a separate southern state contributed to the long-term division between North and South Vietnam. By the end of October 1956, Diem had eliminated or marginalized most internal rivals in the South, instituted a Republican constitution, and established himself as the dominant political authority in what would become a battleground of the Cold War. After the Geneva Accords, the leadership of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam decided that Hanoi would serve as the permanent capital of North Vietnam once French troops completed their withdrawal. Through the autumn of 1954, French forces evacuated the city, and the organs of the revolutionary government moved openly into former colonial administrative buildings. The tricolor came down from flagpoles where it had flown for decades, replaced by the red banner with its golden star. The work of rebuilding a state began in earnest. Between 1955 and 1958, the government reorganized its central ministries, nearly doubling the number of agencies to around 26 in order to support the development of a centrally planned economy. At its September 1955 session, the First National Assembly approved a major expansion and differentiation of government functions, establishing separate ministries for industry, trade, communications, irrigation, and social relief. Each ministry became a node in an expanding bureaucratic network designed to direct economic and social life according to socialist principles. Throughout this period, the 1946 Constitution remained the formal basic law of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, even as practice increasingly reflected a socialist system that had evolved far beyond what the framers of that document had imagined. The Vietnamese Workers' Party, successor to the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, functioned as the leading political force in North Vietnam. The party directed state policy through its Politburo and Central Committee, institutions where the real decisions were made before being ratified by the formal organs of government. The Politburo in this period included key figures who had led the revolution through war and would continue to shape it for decades to come. Ho Chi Minh remained the symbolic and spiritual leader, while Trung Chin, Le Duan, Pham Van Dong, and Vo Nguyen Giap held positions of strategic importance. The Central Committee of the Vietnamese Workers' Party met periodically to approve major lines of policy, including decisions on land reform, economic planning, and the strategy for eventual reunification with the South. The party set the direction, and the state apparatus carried out its will. Formal state organs included the National Assembly, the Government Council, and the Supreme People's Court. The National Assembly was nominally the highest body of state power, responsible for approving laws and major policy decisions. In practice, its role was to ratify what the party had already decided. The Government Council acted as the highest executive and administrative organ, chaired by a premier and including ministers responsible for different sectors of the economy and society. Local state structures were based on people's councils and administrative committees at the province, district, and commune levels, all operating under central oversight. People's councils were defined as local organs of state power, elected by local populations and answerable upward through the hierarchy. Administrative committees served both as local administrative organs and as executive bodies of the people's councils, implementing policies that came down from Hanoi. Mass organizations allied with the party played crucial roles in mobilizing the population. The Vietnam General Confederation of Labor organized industrial workers. The Ho Chi Minh Communist Youth Union focused on young people, channeling their energy into production and political education. The Vietnam Women's Union promoted participation in reconstruction, literacy campaigns, and family welfare programs. Peasant associations reached into every village, linking rural communities to the party-state structure. These organizations served as transmission belts, carrying party directives to the masses and reporting back on local conditions. The Vietnamese Workers' Party maintained cells and committees within state agencies, enterprises, and mass organizations to ensure party leadership over all key institutions. Nothing of importance happened without party guidance. Between 1953 and 1956, the government carried out an extensive land reform campaign that continued to affect rural, social, and political structures after the Geneva Settlement. This campaign reshaped landholding patterns across the countryside, but it also generated disruptions that would require correction in the years that followed. After land redistribution, policy moved toward cooperative farming. The process began with mutual aid teams, small groups of households that pooled labor and some tools while retaining individual land ownership. These teams were intended as transitional forms, familiarizing peasants with collective work and increasing agricultural productivity. By the late 1950s, a large proportion of rural households in the Red River Delta had joined agricultural cooperatives of varying levels of collectivization. Industrial reconstruction after 1954 prioritized repairing and expanding existing plants, developing light industry, and laying foundations for some basic heavy industry with assistance from the Soviet Union and China. 5-year planning methods began to take shape in the late 1950s, though formal, nationwide plans would be more fully articulated after 1960. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam signed economic and technical assistance agreements with both the Soviet Union and China, receiving credits, equipment, and experts for industrial and infrastructure projects. Urban reconstruction in Hanoi and Haiphong included restoring power systems, transportation networks, and housing damaged during the war. State planning organs directed resources toward priorities that the leadership had determined. The government launched literacy campaigns aimed at reducing the illiteracy inherited from the colonial period. Mass classes were organized by local authorities and youth organizations, teaching reading and writing to adults who had never had the opportunity to learn. Health campaigns focused on basic preventive measures, vaccination programs, and the expansion of medical stations at commune and district levels. Education policy promoted the expansion of primary schooling and the creation of secondary schools in provincial centers. Political education accompanied technical training at every level. The state invested in developing cadres and specialists, sending students to socialist countries for higher education and technical training. Young Vietnamese traveled to the Soviet Union and China to learn engineering, medicine, agriculture, and other fields that the country desperately needed. Ideologically, the leadership framed state building as constructing a people's democratic regime in the North while preparing for eventual socialist transformation. The party-state relationship followed a model in which the Vietnamese Workers' Party defined broad strategic lines, and state organs implemented them through laws and administrative measures. In 1957, the National Assembly established a Constitution Amending Committee, chaired by Ho Chi Minh himself, to draft a new basic law suited to post-Geneva conditions. The 1959 Constitution, adopted by the National Assembly in late 1959, replaced the 1946 Constitution and reflected the country's socialist orientation. Article 1 affirmed that Vietnam was one country and that the North and the South were inseparable. This assertion of national unity remained central to the regime's legitimacy, even as the country remained physically divided. The Constitution defined the Democratic Republic of Vietnam as a unified multinationality state, committing the government to maintain unity among its various ethnic groups. The principle of democratic centralism was specified as the guiding method for organizing state power. Under this principle, lower organs were subordinate to higher ones, and all were subordinate to the party's leadership. The National Assembly was empowered to establish specialized committees to work both during sessions and in recess. The Government Council was reaffirmed as the highest executive and administrative organ, explicitly designated as the executive body of the National Assembly. The Third National Party Congress, held in September 1960 in Hanoi, reviewed the country's progress in state building and adopted a new party program. The Congress defined two strategic tasks. The first was carrying out a people's democratic revolution in the South. The second was the transition toward socialism in the North. These were not separate goals, but interconnected elements of a single national revolution. The Congress expanded the party's Central Committee and Secretariat, aiming to strengthen organizational capacity for governing and coordinating the twin challenges of Reconstruction and reunification. In the late 1950s, the concept of socialist legality was introduced, emphasizing rule-based governance through state institutions under party leadership. State propaganda and commemorative practices reinforced legitimacy and mobilized support. Martyrs who had died in the struggle against France were honored. War invalids received recognition and care. The message was clear. The revolution demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice would be remembered. By 1960, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam had built a functioning state apparatus that controlled the North, directed economic development along socialist lines, and maintained close ties with the socialist bloc. The leadership consistently presented the North as a base area for eventual national reunification and as a model of what socialist development could achieve for all of Vietnam. On the 4th of December 1953, while the war against France still raged, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam promulgated a land reform law that would reshape rural society across the North. This law provided the principal legal basis for redistributing land from those who owned much to those who owned little or nothing at all. The campaign it authorized would prove to be one of the most consequential and controversial undertakings of the revolutionary government. The 1953 Land Reform Law authorized three methods for dealing with landlord land. Land belonging to those classified as enemies of the revolution could be confiscated outright. Land owned by other landlords could be requisitioned with compensation. In some cases, land was purchased from owners with payment made in government bonds rather than cash. The stated goal was to transfer land from landlords to poor and landless peasants, fundamentally reshaping class relations in the countryside and creating a rural base for socialist transformation. The land reform campaign was formally conducted between 1953 and 1956, with major implementation continuing after the Geneva Accords in 1954. The leadership drew heavily on Chinese land reform models, including concepts of class struggle and the use of staged campaigns, while adapting these methods to Vietnamese conditions. In preparation for full redistribution, earlier policies had focused on rent reduction, but from late 1953, the emphasis shifted decisively toward confiscation and transfer of ownership. The Vietnamese Workers' Party classified the rural population into categories that would determine who gained and who lost. Landlords were defined as those who derived most of their income from renting out land, with limited direct labor in cultivation. Rich peasants were described as relatively well-off farmers who owned or rented more land than they could farm with family labor alone, and sometimes hired workers. Middle peasants were those whose land and income roughly matched their family's labor capacity. Poor peasants and landless laborers made up the base of the rural pyramid, those who had little or no land of their own. These classifications guided every decision. They determined who would lose land, who would gain it, and who was considered an ally or an opponent in the transformation of the countryside. Land reform was implemented in several waves, each covering designated sets of communes. Teams were sent from higher levels to carry out the work in each locality. One description lists 5 main phases between May 1954 and July 1956, beginning in selected communes of Thanh Nguyen and Thanh Hoa provinces, and later expanding widely across the north. Land reform teams followed a standard process in each locality. They conducted investigations in each village, speaking with residents, gathering information about land holdings and income. They convened meetings to discuss class status, encouraging poor peasants to speak out against those who had exploited them. They classified households according to the established categories and drew up redistribution plans that would transform ownership patterns. Landlords' holdings were measured and recorded, then either confiscated, requisitioned, or partially retained depending on the classification assigned. Confiscated land was redistributed primarily to poor peasants and landless laborers, with some allocation to middle peasants who had shown loyalty to the revolution. The scale of redistribution was substantial. One estimate suggests that about 334,000 hectares of land were redistributed to middle, poor, and poorest peasants during the campaign. Another study cites roughly 810,000 hectares as the total agricultural land transferred to more than 2 million peasants. Land reform also affected communal land, which had previously been allocated by village authorities. A portion of this communal land was reassigned to individual peasants as part of the redistribution process. The government reported that as a result of land reform, most rural households became landholders in their own right, with rights to use, mortgage, and transfer land within legal limits. Land reform campaigns generated significant social and political change in villages. Traditional elites lost land and influence, while poor peasants gained property and formal status in the new order. The implementation was accompanied by political mobilization meetings and public criticism sessions targeting designated landlords, organized by local and higher-level cadres. But the campaign also produced serious problems. By mid-1956, the leadership recognized that significant errors and deviations had occurred in the classification of individuals and in the treatment of those classified. Internal assessments indicated that a high proportion of village-level party and district party organizations had been disrupted by misclassifications and the conflicts that arose from them. Many village party members and activists had been wrongly labeled as landlords or counter-revolutionaries, swept up in a process that sometimes relied more on quotas and accusations than on careful investigation. In the autumn of 1956, Ho Chi Minh publicly acknowledged that mistakes had been made in land reform and called for corrective measures. His admission was a rare moment of official recognition that the revolutionary process had gone astray. Trung Chin, then Party General Secretary and principal advocate of land reform, resigned his post in connection with the acknowledgement of errors. The leadership launched a rectification of errors campaign in early 1957 to review cases, correct classifications, and adjust land allocations where appropriate. The rectification campaign lasted roughly from January to mid-1957, with review teams revisiting previously reformed communes. Official statements during this period indicated that thousands of people who had been detained or punished during land reform were re-evaluated. Some were released or rehabilitated. Families that had been wrongly classified saw their status corrected, but the rectification campaign did not reverse land reform as such. It sought to correct specific misapplications while retaining the overall redistribution outcomes. The land remained with those who had received it. After rectification, the government emphasized strengthening party organizations in villages that had been weakened or disrupted by the earlier campaigns. The errors had damaged trust and created divisions that would take years to heal. Yet land reform had also created a rural social base of small landholding peasants, which the leadership considered essential for the next phase of transformation. These new landowners, who had gained their fields through the revolution, would become the foundation for collectivization. Their gratitude and their stake in the new order made them natural supporters of policies that promised to build on what they had gained. In 1955, the party introduced mutual aid teams, small groups of households that pooled labor and some tools while retaining individual land ownership. These teams were intended as a transitional form of collective work, designed to increase productivity and familiarize peasants with cooperative practices. Members were usually compensated based on work points reflecting their labor contributions, while land remained individually owned. In the second half of the 1950s, policy moved from mutual aid teams toward low-level agricultural cooperatives, where land was worked collectively while ownership arrangements were gradually adjusted. Low-level cooperatives typically pooled land, draft animals, and some equipment, with distribution of output based on both land and labor contributions. By around 1958 and 1959, policy encouraged the formation of higher-level cooperatives, with more complete pooling of land and means of production and distribution mainly according to labor performed. The government permitted households to retain small private plots, sometimes referred to as 5% land, for supplementary production even within cooperative frameworks. These plots provided vegetables, small livestock, and other essential goods that supplemented the collective output and allowed families some measure of self-sufficiency. Between 1954 and 1958, per capita paddy rice production in North Vietnam increased substantially. One estimate cites a rise of over 60%, which official sources linked partly to land reform and collective efforts. State procurement prices for cooperative output were generally set below market levels, which later created tensions regarding incentives. But these problems became more pronounced after 1960. During the late 1950s, land and cooperative policies were increasingly codified in local regulations and central directives, integrating agrarian changes into broader socialist planning. The land reform and early collectivization campaigns were presented in official discourse as key steps in transforming North Vietnam from a semi-feudal agrarian society toward a socialist economy. At the same time, internal analyses and subsequent scholarly studies highlight both the achievements of agrarian redistribution and the significant political and social disruptions caused by the campaign's excesses. Land reform had changed the face of the northern countryside forever, but at a cost that would not soon be forgotten. In the mid-1950s, the religious landscape of South Vietnam was as complex as its political terrain. Buddhists made up an estimated 70 to 80% of the population, forming the religious majority in most rural communities and many urban neighborhoods. Roman Catholics constituted roughly 7 to 10% of South Vietnam's population, but they were concentrated in certain regions and influential urban areas, giving them a political weight beyond their numbers. The migration from north to south following the Geneva Accords would dramatically reshape this balance. Between 1954 and 1955, approximately 600,000 to 700,000 Northern Catholics made the journey southward, fleeing what they feared would be persecution under the atheist government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. This influx significantly increased the Catholic share of the southern population and created new political dynamics. Many of these refugees settled in or around Saigon Chalon, as well as in newly established resettlement areas in the Mekong Delta and central coastal provinces. Entire parishes relocated together, priests leading their congregations to new homes in a land they did not know. They arrived with little more than the clothes on their backs and the faith that had sustained them through the journey. The Diem government publicly praised Catholic refugees as patriotic and staunchly anti-communist, viewing them as a key support base for the new regime. These communities received notable resettlement assistance from the Saigon government and American agencies, including land allocations, housing materials, and food aid. Catholic communities in South Vietnam maintained strong institutional links with the Roman Catholic hierarchy, including Bishop Ngo Dinh Thuc, President Diem's elder brother. Under Diem, Catholics were disproportionately represented in senior government, military, and security posts relative to their share of the population. The 1956 Constitution of the Republic of Vietnam formally guaranteed freedom of religion and stated that no religion was the state religion. Constitutional debates framed religious freedom as a marker distinguishing the republic from officially atheist communist regimes to the north. Despite this constitutional neutrality, observers noted that Catholicism enjoyed a degree of informal favor in appointments and policy orientation under Diem's administration. Buddhism remained legally recognized and widely practiced throughout the South. Pagodas, monastic orders, and lay associations were active in religious and social life. In 1956, Vietnamese Buddhist circles issued important statements emphasizing Buddhism's compatibility with democratic values, reflecting interest in a public role for Buddhist ethics in the new republic. But during the 1954 to 1960 period, organized Buddhist institutions in the South were relatively fragmented along regional and sectarian lines. There was no single unified national body that could speak for all Buddhists with one voice. Diem's government often treated Buddhism as a cultural and moral resource, but did not integrate Buddhist leaders into the core of the political apparatus. Beyond the traditional religions stood the indigenous faiths that had emerged in Vietnam during the colonial period. The Kalau religion, founded in the 1920s and centered on the Holy See at Tay Ninh, claimed several 100,000 devoted followers in southern Vietnam by the early 1950s. Before 1954, the Cao Dai maintained significant armed forces that controlled territory in Tay Ninh and parts of neighboring provinces. These were not merely religious communities, but organized political military structures with their own hierarchies, revenue sources, and territorial ambitions. The Hoa Hao Buddhist reform movement, which had originated in the Mekong Delta in 1939, also fielded armed units that controlled areas in Njiang and surrounding provinces. Founded by the mystic Hun Phu So, the Hoa Hao combined Buddhist reform with Vietnamese nationalism and had developed a devoted following among Delta peasants. During the First Indochina War, Cao Dai and Hoa Hao forces had at times cooperated with French authorities and at other times pursued independent agendas. They were powers unto themselves, answering to neither Saigon nor Paris, and they intended to keep it that way. In early 1955, the Binh Xuyen, Cao Dai, Hoa Hao, and other groups formed a united front to challenge Diem's authority and defend their autonomy. The Binh Xuyen, though not primarily religious, was closely intertwined with sect forces and controlled parts of Saigon Cholon through police and militia structures. American and French observers regarded the sects as both a potential bulwark against communism and a barrier to the central state consolidation that Diem sought. The struggle that followed would determine the future of these organizations. Colonel Trinh Minh Tay, a Cao Dao-linked commander, shifted his allegiance and cooperated with Diem during the 1955 struggle against the Binh Xuyen. General Nguyen Thanh Phuong, another Cao Dai commander, declared support for Diem in July 1955, contributing Cao Dai troops to Saigon's security. With support from these factions, Diem's army defeated the Binh Xuyen in the Battle of Saigon in April and May of 1955. After the Binh Xuyen defeat, Diem moved to curtail the independent military power of the Cao Dai and Hoa Hao. In October 1955, government-aligned forces surrounded the Cao Dai Holy See at Tay Ninh and disarmed substantial numbers of Cao Dai troops. By late 1955, many Cao Dai armed units had either been incorporated into the National Army, disbanded, or pushed into marginal or clandestine status. Hoa Hao armed forces faced similar military pressure from Diem's army in mid-1955, particularly against commanders perceived as resistant to central authority. Some Hoa Hao leaders went underground or fled to remote areas, while others negotiated accommodations or joined government forces. Communist organizations in the South later sought to recruit disaffected elements from Cao Dai and Hoa Hao backgrounds into insurgent networks. The grievances created by Diem's suppression of the sects would provide fertile ground for revolutionary appeals in the troubled years to come. By 1956, Diem's government claimed to have largely dissolved the sect's military autonomy, portraying the National Army as the sole legitimate armed force in the Republic of Vietnam. Diem's administration registered religious organizations and monitored their leadership, seeking to ensure that major religious bodies did not develop independent political agendas. Catholic parishes and organizations were encouraged to participate in social welfare, education, and resettlement projects, often with state and American funding. Catholic migrants from the North tended to form compact communities that became strongholds of support for Diem and anti-communist policies. The government sometimes used these Northern Catholic refugee communities as counterweights to older Southern political and religious elites. Buddhist institutions continued to run schools, charities, and local associations across the country, but their political influence remained diffuse and largely outside the central government. Officials in Saigon promoted an image of South Vietnam as a religiously pluralistic and tolerant republic where Buddhism, Catholicism, and other faiths were officially tolerated. At the same time, some domestic and foreign commentators observed a perception of pro-Catholic bias in resource allocation and administrative appointments. In the late 1950s, Buddhist leaders began to discuss national coordination among different Buddhist groups, laying groundwork for more organized political activity that would emerge later. Certain Cao Dai dignitaries accepted government positions or seats in advisory bodies, reflecting a shift from armed autonomy to negotiated participation in the new order. Hua Hao organizations were partly restructured as religious associations under state oversight, even as some former Hua Hao fighters joined anti-Saigon movements. Government propaganda in the second half of the 1950s emphasized unity among religious groups in support of the Republic of Vietnam against communist opponents. The presence of large Catholic refugee communities, weakened but persistent sect networks, and a Buddhist majority created a complex religious landscape that shaped Southern politics throughout this period. Religion in South Vietnam was never merely a matter of personal faith. It was woven into the fabric of political power, community identity, and the ongoing struggle for control of the nation's future. The Catholics who had fled the North saw their survival as dependent on a strong anti-communist state. The Buddhists, though the majority, found themselves without the organizational structures to translate numbers into political influence. The Cao Dai and Hua Hao, stripped of their armies, retained their believers but lost their power to act independently. Each group would chart its own course in the years ahead, and the religious tensions that simmered beneath the surface in the late 1950s would eventually erupt into crises that shook the foundations of the Republic itself. After the July 1954 Geneva Accords, officials in Washington concluded that a non-communist state in southern Vietnam should be supported as part of the broader strategy of containing communist expansion in Asia. The United States had not signed the Geneva Final Declaration and emphasized that it was not formally bound by the provisions calling for nationwide elections in 1956. American policymakers viewed the Democratic Republic of Vietnam's alignment with China and the Soviet Union as reason enough to prevent a communist takeover of the South. President Dwight D. Eisenhower had articulated what became known as the domino theory in April 1954, arguing that the fall of one Southeast Asian country to communism could lead to others following in rapid succession. The image was vivid and persuasive to American policymakers. Vietnam was not just Vietnam. It was the first domino, and if it fell, the rest of Southeast Asia might tumble after it. On the 7th of February 1950, the United States had recognized the state of Vietnam under Bao Dai. After Geneva, attention shifted to whether Ngo Dinh could make that state viable. In September and October of 1954, American officials increasingly came to view Diem as the key anti-communist leader in the South, despite French doubts about his political abilities. On the 26th of October, 1954, President Eisenhower sent a letter to Diem, pledging American economic and military support to help build what he called a strong, viable state capable of resisting attempted subversion or aggression. The letter linked this support to Diem's undertaking of needed reforms to broaden his government and increase its representativeness. It was a bargain that would define the early relationship between Washington and Saigon. In late 1954, American policy documents describe South Vietnam as a critical barrier to further communist expansion in Southeast Asia. After Geneva, the Military Assistance Advisory Group Indochina remained in place but gradually shifted from supporting French forces to advising Vietnamese forces directly. At a Washington conference on the 12th of February 1955, American and French officials agreed that all military aid would henceforth be funneled directly to South Vietnam rather than through France. The arrangement marked a decisive shift in who would guide the Southern military establishment. In November 1955, the advisory group was formally redesignated as the Military Assistance Advisory Group Vietnam, reflecting American recognition of South Vietnam as the primary partner. The group's formal mission was to advise and assist in training and equipping the Army of the Republic of Vietnam within limitations set by the Geneva Accords. American diplomats negotiated with the International Control Commission to interpret Geneva limits so that the number of American advisors could match the earlier total of combined American and French advisors, approximately 888 personnel. By 1959, the advisory group's strength had grown close to this ceiling, with advisors embedded at higher command echelons rather than in tactical units. Diem remained cautious about allowing American advisors directly into operational command positions. He feared losing control over his own armed forces and was sensitive to any arrangement that might make South Vietnam appear to be simply an American puppet. American economic and technical aid to South Vietnam after 1955 was administered primarily through the United States Operations Mission and related agencies. Between 1956 and 1964, American economic aid to South Vietnam was approved at about $2.1 billion, with a substantial portion committed before 1961. Military aid in the 1956 to 1962 period totaled about $750 million, much of it in the form of equipment, supplies, and training support. A Central Intelligence Agency economic comparison estimated that by the end of 1960, American economic assistance to South Vietnam totaled roughly $1.2 billion. Technical assistance programs, amounting to about $24 million by 1960, focused on training administrators, statisticians, nurses, teachers, and agricultural specialists. Aid projects covered sectors such as agriculture, transportation, public administration, education, health, power, and communications. American support after Geneva included financing the resettlement of northern refugees, many of them Catholics, as part of broader efforts to stabilize Diem's political base. The United States Navy's participation in Operation Passage to Freedom, with Task Force 90 transporting refugees from Haiphong to southern ports, reflected early visible American commitment to the new Southern regime. American policy in 1955 and 1956 backed Diem's decision to refuse nationwide elections in 1956, citing the lack of conditions for free elections in the North. National Security Council documents in this period emphasized that free elections were unlikely under conditions controlled by the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and that losing the South would undermine regional security throughout Southeast Asia. In 1955, the Eisenhower administration supported Diem's confrontation with the Binh Xuyen and religious sect forces, interpreting his success as evidence of political strength and leadership potential. American embassy and advisory group reporting during the Battle of Saigon generally favored Diem and criticized the sects as obstacles to building a central state. After Diem's victory over the Binh Xuyen and major sects, American public commentary sometimes referred to this as the Diem miracle. While the United States recognized irregularities in the 1955 referendum, it accepted the outcome and quickly recognized the Republic of Vietnam and Diem's presidency. President Diem visited the United States in 1957 and was welcomed by Eisenhower and Congress, receiving strong public praise as an anti-communist leader and ally. During and after the visit, American officials urged Diem privately to broaden political participation and implement reforms, including changes to land policy. But their advice often went unheeded by Diem. American assessments during 1957 to 1960 increasingly noted authoritarian features in Diem's regime, including repression of opposition and concentration of power in family networks. Nevertheless, policymakers generally concluded that there was no preferable alternative to Diem in the short term, and support continued. Advisory group and embassy personnel sometimes expressed doubts about the effectiveness of Vietnamese army leadership and Diem's political style, even as they advocated for more aid. Training programs for Vietnamese officers and non-commissioned officers were expanded in the late 1950s, including courses inside Vietnam and at American military schools. American advisors worked on organization, logistics, communications, and staff planning, aiming to create an army capable of both conventional defense and internal security. The Joint Chiefs of Staff repeatedly stressed the need to develop an effective South Vietnamese military establishment to reduce the likelihood of direct American combat intervention. American information and psychological operations supported Diem's government, distributing materials that highlighted anti-communist themes and economic progress. In 1957, communist-led armed activities in South Vietnam increased, and the advisory group reported more frequent attacks on Vietnamese army units and American advisory installations. On the 22nd of October 1957, bomb attacks in Saigon targeted the advisory group headquarters and American Information Service facilities, injuring American personnel and underscoring the growing insurgency. American intelligence in 1958 and 1959 noted the formation of what would become the Viet Cong insurgency, linked to support from the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and recommended strengthening counterinsurgency capacity. The Eisenhower administration sought to keep American involvement limited to advising and support, stating publicly that American combat troops were neither required nor desirable at that stage. Some American officials advocated conditioning aid on political liberalization and reforms in South Vietnam, while others prioritized stability and anti-communist reliability over internal democratization. Intelligence analyses in the late 1950s highlighted both Diem's strengths as a determined nationalist and his weaknesses in alienating parts of the Southern population. Between 1954 and 1960, American policy combined strong material support for Diem with periodic but limited pressure for reforms, without fundamentally altering his governing style. By the end of 1960, approximately 900 American military advisors were present in South Vietnam, close to the practical limit that authorities believed compatible with Geneva interpretations. Cumulatively, American aid in the second half of the 1950s made South Vietnam heavily dependent on American economic and military assistance for state operations and defense. Strategic documents at the close of 1960 continued to regard South Vietnam as a critical test case for containment policy in Southeast Asia, a country where American credibility and the broader struggle against communist expansion would be won or lost. The Binh Xuyen had its origins in the 1920s when loosely organized gangs and contract laborers operated in the marshes south of Co Lan. Over the decades, under the leadership of Le Van Vien, also known as Bay Vien, the organization expanded into a powerful criminal paramilitary group that controlled much of the Saigon Chalon underworld. By the early 1950s, Binh Xuyen forces operated from swamp bases southeast of the city, notably in an area that came to be called the Marsh of the Assassins. From these hidden redoubts, they had developed a semi-autonomous fief controlling parts of the Saigon Chalon police, urban streets, and nearby countryside. By 1954, the Binh Xuyen controlled major gambling and prostitution concessions at the Grand Monde in Chalon and the Cloche d'Or in Saigon, establishments that drew visitors from across the region. The organization also dominated the opium trade, much of the fish and charcoal commerce, and operated several hotels and rubber plantations. This was not simply a criminal enterprise, but a parallel government, with revenues that rivaled those of the state itself. The Binh Xuyen command structure combined a central leadership under Le Van Vien with armed units that functioned as both police and private militia, blurring the line between law enforcement and organized crime until the distinction became meaningless. French colonial and State of Vietnam authorities had granted the Binh Xuyen official status as a sect army and entrusted it with running the Saigon Chalon police. This extraordinary arrangement was justified as using Binh Xuyen methods and networks to combat Viet Minh urban activities. The French reasoned that criminals who knew the city's secrets could root out revolutionaries more effectively than regular police. By 1954, estimates of Binh Xuyen troop strength ranged from roughly 5,000 to 8,000 armed men, a formidable force by any measure. The Cao Dai and Hoa Hao sects, with tens of thousands of followers each, maintained their own armed forces and administrative structures west and southwest of Saigon, creating a patchwork of competing powers around the capital that left the central government unable to claim full sovereignty over its own territory. In September 1954, General Nguyen Van Hin, a pro-French chief of staff, clashed with Prime Minister Ngo Diem over control of the army. During this army crisis, the Binh Xuyen initially aligned with Diem against Hin, whom they suspected of plotting a coup. But by late 1954, Diem's government sought to reduce Binh Xuyen autonomy, especially over the Saigon Chalon police and security apparatus. The alliance of convenience began to fray. Bao Dai, still chief of state, maintained ties with the Binh Xuyen and sect leaders, viewing them as a counterweight to Diem. In early 1955, the Cao Dai, Hoa Hao, and Binh Xuyen formed a united front of national forces to press for Diem's removal or major concessions. The United Front requested that Bao Dai dismiss Diem and form a broader coalition government that would include sect representatives. But Diem refused to resign or share power. He chose instead to confront the Binh Xuyen militarily, gambling everything on his ability to break their hold on the capital. On the 29th of March 1955, Binh Xuyen units attacked government positions in Saigon, including the National Army headquarters and areas near the Prime Minister's residence. The fighting was sudden and intense, catching many residents by surprise as gunfire erupted in streets where they had walked peacefully just hours before. French commander General Gambiers mediated a temporary truce on the 31st of March to halt the initial clashes, but the underlying conflict remained unresolved. The ceasefire was fragile, and everyone knew it would not hold. During March and April, French authorities and American Ambassador J. Lawton Collins debated whether Diem should be replaced by another Southern leader who might be more willing to accommodate the sects. Some French officials favored removing Diem and relying on a coalition that included sect leaders, arguing that stability required compromise. American officials were divided on the question but increasingly inclined to back Diem, who at least represented a clear anti-communist position. The debate continued even as both sides prepared for the fighting that seemed inevitable. In April 1955, Diem issued an ultimatum requiring the Binjuyen to accept government control by integrating into the National Army or disbanding entirely. The Binjuyen leadership refused and prepared defenses in their strongholds throughout Saigon Chalon. On the 27th and 28th of April, Diem's Vietnamese National Army launched what became known as the Battle of Saigon against Binjuyen positions. The fighting was concentrated in the Cholon district and parts of central Saigon, where Binjuyen forces used buildings and narrow streets for defense. The Vietnamese National Army employed infantry, armor, and artillery to dislodge Binjuyen units from police headquarters, casinos, and key intersections. The sound of artillery echoed through streets that had known decades of colonial rule but never fighting like this. Within about a week, by early May 1955, Diem's forces had largely driven the Binjuyen out of Saigon Cholon. Remaining Binjuyen elements retreated toward the swampy areas southeast of Saigon, where they faced continuing pursuit and operations by government troops. The marshes that had once sheltered them became a trap as army units closed in from multiple directions. The defeat of the Binjuyen ended their control over Saigon Cholon's police, gambling, and vice activities. The casinos that had operated with impunity now stood empty or under new management. In parallel, Diem used financial incentives and negotiations to bring some Cao Dai and Hua Hao commanders and units under National Army control. Other Cao Dai and Hua Hao leaders refused integration and continued resistance in provincial areas, but they no longer wielded the same influence in Saigon. By mid-1955, Diem had effectively removed the Binjuyen as a political military force in the capital and reduced sect leverage over Saigon's security services. The transformation was remarkable. Just months earlier, the Prime Minister had struggled to control even his own capital. Now he commanded forces capable of imposing his will across the city. After the April and May fighting, Cao Dai's capacity to influence events in Saigon diminished dramatically, as his key armed supporters had lost ground and scattered into the countryside or neighboring territories. In June 1955, Diem further weakened Cao Dai by stripping the chief of state of crown lands and pressing the royal family council to criticize his leadership. American Secretary of State John Foster Dulles informed General Collins in May 1955 that Diem's victory over the Binjuyen had strengthened his political position considerably. Following the Battle of Saigon, Washington shifted from considering Diem's removal to viewing him as the best available anti-communist leader in the South. French officials, by contrast, saw their influence erode as Diem's consolidation of control over Saigon's police and army reduced the need for French mediation. Central Intelligence Agency and embassy assessments from mid-1955 described Diem's survival of the sect crisis as a major turning point in South Vietnamese politics that few had predicted. What had seemed like an impossible situation just months before, with the Prime Minister surrounded by armed enemies in his own capital, had transformed into a decisive victory that changed everything. The suppression of the Binjuyen also altered organized crime patterns in Saigon, with former Binjuyen rackets partly taken over by new actors and security services loyal to the government. The underworld that had operated with impunity for so long now had to accommodate new masters who demanded different arrangements. Diem capitalized on the victory in propaganda, presenting his government as restoring order and national authority in the capital after years of fragmentation and chaos. Foreign press coverage in 1955 highlighted the unusual spectacle of a criminal sect army controlling a capital city and the political significance of Diem's decision to confront it directly rather than negotiate another compromise. The defeat of the Binjuin and weakening of sect forces allowed Diem to enter the 1955 referendum campaign with a substantially strengthened grip on Saigon. His opponents had been scattered, and those who remained dared not challenge him openly. By the end of 1955, Saigon Chalon's internal security was largely under the control of the National Police and Army loyal to Diem, rather than semi-autonomous sect forces operating according to their own interests. The struggle for Saigon in 1954 and 1955 thus transformed the city from a patchwork of sect and gang zones into a capital more directly administered by the central government. Streets that had belonged to the Binjuin now belonged to the state. The battle had been won, but the methods Diem used to win it, the concentration of power and the reliance on force, would shape the nature of his rule for years to come and create new problems even as it solved old ones. On the 2nd of September 1954, a political organization that would become central to Diem's rule was formally recognized by decree. The Kung Lao Nyun v Kek Mank Dang, commonly known as the Kung Lao Party or the Personalist Labor Revolutionary Party, was designed to support Ngoding Diem and ensure loyalty throughout the state apparatus. Ngoding Nu, Diem's brother, served as general secretary and principal organizer of this new party. The Kung Lao operated as a semi-secret cadre organization, with membership often seen as necessary for career advancement in the civil service and military. The party was heavily influenced by personalism, an ideology drawing on French Catholic personalist thought and adapted to Vietnamese conditions by NUU. In 1955, NU launched a governmentization policy aimed at placing Kung Lao members in about 70% of important government positions. The goal was to ensure that every significant decision passed through hands loyal to the ruling family. On the 6th of July, 1955, NU created an Office for Social and Political Studies, led by Trun Kim Twin, which functioned as an intelligence and political analysis organ for the regime. NU also established a Special Forces unit under Lê Quang Tung, which reported directly to the presidency and the Kung Lao leadership rather than through normal military channels. In 1956, Diem and Nu created the Personalism Training Center in Vinh Long to train key personnel in regime ideology and political techniques. Between 1956 and 1963, this center trained roughly 25,000 officials and cadres for government and party work. The training instilled loyalty and provided a common ideological framework for those who would administer the state. The 1955 State of Vietnam referendum on the head of state, held on the 23rd of October 1955, was organized under Diem's government and Kung Lao influence. Official results gave Diem 98.2% of the vote versus 1.8% for Bao Dai. External observers widely viewed the process as heavily manipulated. In Saigon alone, the number of ballots cast for Diem exceeded the number of registered voters. But the outcome served its purpose. On the 26th of October, 1955, after the referendum, Diem proclaimed the Republic of Vietnam and became its first president. On the same date, a provisional constitutional framework was announced pending the election of a constitutional assembly. Constitutional Assembly elections were held on the 4th of March 1956 to draft a permanent constitution for the Republic of Vietnam. In this election, 431 candidates competed for 123 seats, representing 5 registered pro-government parties and some independents. The main pro-government parties included the National Revolutionary Movement and the Revolutionary Labor Party, both aligned with Diem. Official results awarded 61 seats to the National Revolutionary Movement, 25 to the Citizens' Assembly, 15 to the Revolutionary Labor Party, 8 to the Movement to Win and Preserve Freedom, and 1 to the Die Viet Progressive Party, plus 11 pro-government independents. Scholars note that the 1956 Assembly election allowed some opposition and independent candidates and was more competitive than the 1955 referendum, though it remained under government control. Campaign materials had to be screened by authorities, and candidates could be barred for alleged links to Viet Minh or rebel groups. The Constitutional Assembly adopted the 1956 Constitution on the 26th of October 1956 and then reconstituted itself as the National Assembly. The 1956 Constitution established a presidential system with a strong executive, a unicameral National Assembly, and an independent judiciary on paper. Article 18 guaranteed citizens the right to vote and participate in public affairs under conditions prescribed by law. Articles 19 and 31 specified nationwide direct elections for president and vice president with eligibility criteria set by law. Articles 48 and 49 provided for National Assembly deputies to be elected by universal, direct, and secret ballot, with electoral districts defined by law. Article 65 mandated that National Assembly sessions be public, with verbatim reports published in the official journal. In practice, the Kung Lao and associated networks strongly influenced candidate selection and electoral administration. Ordinance Number 6, issued on the 11th of January 1956, authorized the government to detain individuals deemed dangerous to national defense and common security. This ordinance was used to imprison suspected communists as well as non-communist opponents, including former sect members and nationalist critics. Security operations after 1955 reportedly reduced Communist Party membership in South Vietnam by about two-thirds between 1955 and 1959. The regime operated re-education camps and prisons for political detainees, including suspected Viet Minh and dissident nationalists. In May 1959, Law 1059 authorized special military tribunals to impose harsh penalties, including capital punishment, on persons accused of activities linked to communist or subversive organizations. The law permitted rapid trials and the use of mobile military courts in rural areas, giving security forces wide discretion. Domestic and foreign critics argued that Ordinance Number 6 and Law 1059 granted the executive extensive powers against political opposition with minimal judicial oversight. Diem's government placed restrictions on the press, including pre-publication censorship and licensing requirements for newspapers. Political parties other than pro-government groups operated under tight constraints, and attempts to form broad non-communist opposition parties were closely monitored. The Die Viet nationalist current, with roots before 1954, struggled to operate legally and saw several of its leaders marginalized or detained. Religious political organizations, including certain Cao Dai and Hoa Hao factions, were discouraged from maintaining independent political programs after their military defeat. The Kung Lao extended networks into the military, civil service, student groups, and professional associations, serving as a mechanism of political control that reached into every corner of public life. Intelligence reporting in the late 1950s noted that membership in the Kung Lao was often associated with promotion within the Army of the Republic of Vietnam Officer Corps. Some senior officers complained that political loyalty and Kung Lao ties were prioritized over professional competence in promotions, creating resentment among those who saw themselves passed over despite their abilities. The National Revolutionary Movement functioned as a public, pro-government party, while the Kung Lao remained semi-covert and cadre-based. National Assembly elections were held again on the 30th of August, 1959, for 123 seats. In this election, pro-government parties and independents won 121 of the seats, leaving only 2 to opposition independents, according to official results. Despite some formal liberalization, the 1959 election was described in a later intelligence report as one of the most openly manipulated of South Vietnamese elections. Opposition candidates such as Phan Quang Dan managed to win seats in 1959, but several were prevented from taking their seats through challenges and arrests. Phan Quang Dan himself was arrested on charges of electoral fraud after the election and barred from attending the first National Assembly session. The National Assembly possessed constitutional powers to approve laws and budgets, but in practice it rarely blocked presidential initiatives. Local councils existed at province and district levels, but governors and district chiefs were centrally appointed and often linked to Kung Lao networks. Non-communist opposition included intellectuals, students, some Buddhists, certain former sect leaders, and urban professionals dissatisfied with Diem's concentration of power. Some favored a more pluralistic system while still opposing the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. American diplomatic correspondents in the late 1950s expressed concern about the suppression of moderate non-communist opponents who might otherwise broaden the regime's base. Nevertheless, American policy continued to support Diem, with officials often judging that his regime, despite its flaws, was preferable to potential alternatives. By 1960, political discontent within the army and urban elites contributed to the 11th of November coup attempt against Diem, led by paratroop officers. The coup plotters cited the influence of the Ngo family, Kung Lao favoritism, and restrictions on political life as key grievances. The attempt failed, but it signaled growing opposition to Diem's political system within some segments of the South Vietnamese establishment. Between 1955 and 1960, the Republic of Vietnam's political system combined constitutional forms, including elections, a legislature, and legal guarantees, with extensive informal control exercised through the presidency, security laws, and the Kung Lao network that reached into every institution. After the Geneva Accords, President Diem's government launched what it called the Denunciation of Communists campaign. The aim was to root out former Viet Minh networks that had remained in South Vietnam following the partition. Security forces fanned out across the countryside, searching villages, questioning residents, and compiling lists of suspected sympathizers. The campaign was relentless in its scope and ambition. On the 11th of January 1956, Ordinance Numero 6 granted the president authority to detain anyone deemed dangerous to national defense and public security, bypassing ordinary judicial procedures entirely. Under this sweeping law, suspects could be confined in re-education centers and prisons for extended periods, subject only to executive review rather than the scrutiny of independent courts. The campaign's reach extended far beyond confirmed communist cadres. Former Viet Minh sympathizers, members of the defeated religious sects, and even some non-communist nationalists found themselves caught in the security net. Neighbors turned informant, and old grudges found new expression in denunciations that could destroy a family overnight. By the late 1950s, South Vietnamese and American reports estimated that tens of thousands of suspected communists and political opponents had been arrested or detained under these sweeping security laws. The government established a network of detention facilities where political prisoners were held for indoctrination and forced labor, cut off from the families and communities that had once sustained them through years of war and hardship. In rural areas, pacification programs brought village-level searches, interrogations, and mandatory registration to communities that had known relative peace since the ceasefire. Anyone suspected of past Viet Minh affiliation faced scrutiny, and denunciations by neighbors could lead to arrest without warning. The Civil Guard, created in 1955, served as a paramilitary force for internal security under the Ministry of Interior, patrolling the roads and waterways that connected hamlets to district towns. The Self-Defense Corps placed armed village units of 4 to 10 men in communities of 1,000 or more residents. These local militias were meant to guard against subversion and intimidation, but in many areas, the Self-Defense Corps members received minimal training and remained vulnerable to insurgent pressure. They were farmers given rifles and a few days of instruction, expected to stand against hardened revolutionaries who had fought the French for nearly a decade. The government also pursued resettlement and land distribution programs for northern refugees and loyalist populations, sometimes reallocating land that had belonged to suspected communist supporters. In certain contested zones, rural families were relocated to more secure areas, though a systematic, strategic hamlet program would not emerge until after 1961. Communist cadres who had remained in the South after Geneva faced mounting pressure from arrests, informant networks, and security sweeps that decimated their ranks. Many went deeper underground, hiding in the forests and marshes, waiting for the moment when circumstances might turn in their favor. North Vietnamese and Southern Communist accounts describe this period as one of white terror in the countryside, a time when revolutionaries were hunted relentlessly and their organizations driven to the edge of extinction. A 1960 CIA National Intelligence estimate acknowledged that Diem's security operations had significantly weakened the communist infrastructure in the South, but it also noted that these same methods had generated resentment among segments of the rural population. Heavy-handed tactics alienated villagers who might otherwise have remained neutral, pushing some towards sympathy with the very insurgents the government sought to destroy. The security forces could not distinguish between a genuine communist and an innocent farmer caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. And this inability bred fear and anger in equal measure. By 1957, communist and other anti-government groups began responding with a campaign of targeted killings. Village chiefs, hamlet officials, and local representatives of Diem's regime became marked men. One study later estimated that insurgents carried out approximately 1,700 assassinations of officials and 2,000 kidnappings between 1957 and 1960. Another contemporary estimate suggested that, on average, about one South Vietnamese government employee per day was killed by insurgent attacks during this period. The violence struck hardest in provinces like Long An, My Tho, and An Xuyen, where local officials lived in constant fear and some refused to sleep in their own homes at night. In 1957, insurgent violence expanded beyond the countryside to include bombings in urban centers, bringing the conflict to Saigon itself. On the 22nd of October that year, explosions rocked the U.S. Military Assistance Advisory Group headquarters and the USIS Library in Saigon, injuring American personnel and signaling that no place was truly safe from the gathering storm. By 1958, U.S. and South Vietnamese intelligence reported increasing numbers of ambushes against ARVN patrols and attacks on outposts across multiple provinces. The insurgency was growing bolder with each passing month. The armed units responsible for this violence were initially organized under local and regional leadership, operating with considerable autonomy from any central command. The term Viet Cong came into general use by the late 1950s to describe these communist guerrillas who struck from the shadows and melted back into the population. In 1956, Southern Communist leader Lê Duẩn had drafted a strategy advocating renewed armed struggle in the South, a document debated within the DRV leadership in Hanoi. North Vietnamese leaders hesitated initially, partly due to Chinese and Soviet caution about open confrontation after Geneva, but gradually they moved toward supporting Southern armed action as the only viable path forward. In 1959, the DRV Politburo approved a more proactive policy of revolutionary violence in the South, formally shifting from primarily political struggle to people's war. That same May, North Vietnam created Group 559 to develop and manage supply routes through Laos and later Cambodia, laying the foundations for what would become known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Group 559's mission was to move personnel, weapons, and supplies from North Vietnam to southern insurgent units while avoiding detection by South Vietnamese and Allied forces. In parallel, Group 759 was formed to organize sea routes for infiltration along the Vietnamese coast, opening multiple pathways for the movement of men and material. On the 6th of May 1959, responding to the surge in attacks, the South Vietnamese National Assembly enacted Law 1059. This legislation expanded the use of military tribunals for security cases, making a wide range of activities punishable by death or long prison terms. The law authorized mobile military tribunals to operate in provincial areas, allowing rapid trials and sentences with limited appeal. Officially, Law 1059 was presented as necessary to protect rural populations from insurgent violence, but DRV propaganda denounced it as a major instrument of repression that provoked further resistance in the countryside. South Vietnamese statistics cited in American analyses showed a sharp increase in reported terrorist incidents and clashes from 1957 to 1960. Violence between insurgents and government forces reportedly rose from about 180 clashes in January 1960 to around 545 in September of that year. According to later estimates, insurgent forces in the South grew from about 5,000 in early 1959 to roughly 10 to 15,000 by the end of 1960. The numbers told a story of accelerating conflict that showed no signs of abating. In early 1960, 18 prominent South Vietnamese intellectuals and politicians issued the Caravel Manifesto, criticizing Diem's authoritarian methods and calling for meaningful reforms. The president responded by arresting some signatories and tightening control over the opposition press and political organizations. The failed paratrooper coup attempt on the 11th of November 1960 reflected deeper discontent with security policies and the concentration of power in Diem's hands. After the failed coup, the government arrested numerous suspected sympathizers, further narrowing the space for legal opposition. Communist accounts identify the Dom Co movement, which began in Bang Tre province in January 1960 as a major escalation in rural armed struggle. These simultaneous uprisings combined local revolts, attacks on government posts, and the establishment of liberated hamlets in parts of the Mekong Delta and Central Coast. In December 1960, the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam was formally established as a political umbrella for the Southern insurgency. American intelligence assessments from that year concluded that although Saigon retained control of major cities and lines of communication, insurgent influence was growing steadily in rural areas. The warnings were unmistakable. Continued political rigidity and heavy-handed security measures risked driving more villagers into the arms of the insurgents. By the end of 1960, most external observers agreed that South Vietnam faced a serious and expanding rebellion rooted in both local grievances and support flowing steadily from the north. After Geneva, the leadership in Hanoi publicly emphasized peaceful reunification through the elections promised in the Accords. But behind the rhetoric, party documents reveal that covert political struggle in the South continued without interruption. The revolution had not ended. It had merely entered a new phase. In August 1955, the 8th plenum of the Vietnamese Workers' Party Central Committee concluded that peaceful unification was uncertain at best, and that the DRV should consolidate socialism in the North while maintaining revolutionary networks in the South as a reserve force for the future. This was the North First strategy, a pragmatic approach that prioritized reconstruction and state building above the 17th parallel while keeping Southern political structures in place for the day when they might be needed again. Some North Vietnamese intellectuals in 1955 argued that rapid socialist construction in the North could actually complicate peaceful unification, advocating caution in the pace of transformation. These debates influenced early policy, tempering the most radical impulses with practical considerations. Throughout 1956 and 1957, DRV media continued to call for implementation of the Geneva elections, even as President Diem in the South publicly refused to participate in any such process. At the same time, DRV authorities maintained contact with Southern communist cadres through clandestine channels, encouraging them to preserve their organization under increasingly difficult conditions. The harsh repression of suspected communists in the South after 1955 was monitored closely in Hanoi, where it was seen as undermining whatever prospects might have existed for peaceful competition. Reports from the South described a decimation of revolutionary networks with cadres arrested, killed, or forced into hiding. Lê Duan, who had remained in the South after 1954 to direct revolutionary work, drafted the 1956 outline of the Southern Revolution, a document that argued the Southern struggle needed its own strategy under national leadership. The outline stressed political mobilization and organization in rural and urban areas, but also acknowledged the possibility of armed struggle if repression continued to close off other avenues. By late 1957, Southern Communist reports to Hanoi described a significant weakening of local networks due to arrests, killings, and defections. The situation was growing desperate. In 1957 and 1958, DRV leaders debated how far to go in supporting renewed violence in the South, balancing domestic reconstruction needs against the risk of international escalation. Chinese and Soviet advice in this period generally urged caution, with emphasis on political struggle and avoidance of open war with forces backed by the United States. Despite this foreign counsel, North Vietnamese leaders increasingly concluded that Diem's consolidation of power and refusal to hold elections made peaceful reunification unlikely, if not impossible. In 1958, Le Duan returned to Hanoi and gradually emerged as a leading advocate for a more forceful strategy toward the South. His voice carried weight, for he had seen firsthand the suffering of Southern cadres and understood the urgency of their plight. Internal party discussions in 1958 and 1959 centered on whether to continue primarily legal and political methods in the South or to authorize broad armed struggle. The debate was intense, for the stakes could not have been higher. The 15th plenum of the Vietnamese Workers' Party Central Committee, held in January 1959, marked a turning point. The meeting adopted Resolution 15, a key document authorizing the combination of political and armed struggle in the South. The resolution concluded that revolutionary violence, including armed action, was necessary to overthrow Diem's regime when other methods proved ineffective. It called for building a people's armed force in the South alongside political organizations, formalizing support for guerrilla activities that had already begun to emerge in scattered provinces. Resolution 15 also reaffirmed the two strategic tasks: building socialism in the North and carrying out national democratic revolution in the South. These were not separate struggles, but two fronts of a single war for national reunification. Following the resolution, the DRV increased guidance and material assistance to Southern armed units while still operating largely through covert channels. The hand of Hanoi would be felt in the South, but it would be a hidden hand, at least for now. In May 1959, the DRV Politburo ordered the creation of a land-based infiltration and supply route system through the Trung Son Range, the mountainous spine running along Vietnam's western border. On the 19th of May 1959, the Ministry of Defense established Transportation Group 559, named for the 5th month of that year, to construct and manage this strategic route. Group 559 was placed under Colonel Va Bum and headquartered in Laos's Hoa Phan province near the North Vietnamese border. Its mandate was to develop and maintain the Truong Son supply route, which would later become known to the world as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Early operations of Group 559 focused on foot trails and pack routes across the demilitarized zone and adjacent Laotian territory, transporting mainly cadre rather than heavy weapons. The trails were carved through some of the most difficult terrain in Southeast Asia, along jungle paths and mountain ridges where porters moved in single file beneath canopies so thick that sunlight rarely reached the ground. By late 1959, Group 559 had grown to about 6,000 personnel organized in at least 2 regiments, supported by Laotian and Vietnamese civilian labor. Initial infiltration efforts concentrated on sending trained Southern cadres who had regrouped in the North after 1954 back to their home regions in the South. These infiltrators typically traveled in small groups, using a combination of overland routes through Laos and short segments across the DMZ. In parallel with land routes, the DRV created Transportation Group 759 in 1959 to organize seaborne infiltration and supply operations along the Vietnamese coast. Group 759 initially operated about 20 steel-hulled vessels capable of covertly delivering personnel and equipment to coastal points in the south. North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao cooperation in Laos facilitated secure staging areas and way stations for Group 559's operations. In September 1959, the DRV established Group 959 to coordinate support for the Pathet Lao and manage supply routes through northeastern Laos for both Laotian and Southern Vietnamese forces. From 1959 onward, the DRV used the Laos corridor to avoid direct confrontation along the heavily monitored DMZ between North and South Vietnam. North Vietnamese documents describe the Truong Son route as a lifeline connecting the revolutionary bases of North and South Vietnam. The DRV's Rear Services Directorate oversaw logistical planning for Group 559, integrating it with broader military supply systems. In 1959 and 1960, the route carried mainly people, small arms, ammunition, and communications equipment. Heavy weapon shipments would become more common only later. Coordination between Hanoi and Southern Communist leadership was institutionalized through the establishment of the Central Office for South Vietnam, known as COSVN, located in border regions. COSVN served as the highest political and military command for the Southern Revolution, transmitting DRV directives and reporting on conditions in the South. Southern revolutionary committees and armed units were instructed to follow the combined political and armed struggle line laid out in Resolution 15. Jorvi propaganda after 1959 increasingly portrayed Southern armed actions as self-defense against Diem's repression, while internally viewing them as part of a coordinated campaign for reunification. In 1960, Le Duan, speaking in Hanoi, reiterated that the South's liberation would be a long struggle combining political mobilization and armed actions over many years. Chinese and Soviet sources monitored these shifts with interest. Some documents suggest Beijing was more supportive of militant tactics than Moscow at this stage, though both socialist powers provided aid to the DRV. While Resolution 15 authorized armed struggle, internal debates continued over the pace and scale of escalation, reflecting differing assessments of how the United States might react. DRV leaders consistently framed support to the South as part of a single national revolution, with the North as the base area supplying manpower and material to the Revolutionary Front. The Third National Party Congress in September 1960 codified this dual-task strategy, emphasizing socialist construction in the North and People's Democratic Revolution in the South as two inseparable aspects of the same struggle. Congress resolutions validated earlier decisions, including Resolution 15 and the creation of the Trung Son route, as components of a unified strategy for national reunification. By late 1960, DRV support had helped Southern forces expand into what would become the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, founded in December of that year. American intelligence assessments from 1960 noted that increased infiltration from the North and improved organization were strengthening the insurgency in the South. Hanoi's turn toward supporting armed struggle had evolved over 6 years, from cautious coexistence and political competition to a formally sanctioned combination of political and military methods that would shape the conflict for decades to come. The 1954 Geneva Accords recognized the Kingdom of Laos and the Kingdom of Cambodia as independent states and called for the withdrawal of foreign forces from their territories. In Laos, the ceasefire agreement required all non-Laotian troops to withdraw within 4 months, with exceptions made only for limited French instructors and garrisons that remained under strict conditions. The Pathet Lao, a Laotian communist movement closely linked to the Viet Minh, was required to regroup its forces in the northern provinces of Phong Sa and Sam Nua pending a political settlement. An international commission for supervision and control for Laos, composed of India, Canada, and Poland, was established to monitor compliance with the Geneva settlement, though its reach into remote mountain terrain would prove limited. In Cambodia, the Geneva settlement required the withdrawal of all Viet Minh and French forces and the demobilization of Khmer Issarak resistance units that had operated during the First Indochina War. Cambodia's delegation at Geneva insisted that independence would include the right to seek foreign military assistance, resisting proposals for strict permanent neutrality that would have limited the kingdom's options. Cambodia nonetheless pledged not to host foreign bases or join alliances contrary to the United Nations Charter unless its security was directly threatened, a careful balance between sovereignty and strategic flexibility. In Laos, the Pathet Lao retained de facto control of Sam Nua and Phong Sa after 1954, administering these provinces alongside the Royal Lao government in what was supposed to be a transitional arrangement. The continued Pathet Lao presence in these two provinces gave North Vietnam a friendly corridor along Laos's northeastern border, a geographic advantage of immense strategic importance. Hanoi viewed the Pathet Lao as both a Laotian ally in the broader anti-imperialist struggle and as a strategic asset for protecting North Vietnam's western flank against any hostile advance. Throughout the late 1950s, Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese forces maintained bases and training areas in the Sam Nua and Phung Sali region, creating a sanctuary that would prove invaluable in the years ahead. Laos's internal politics after 1954 were characterized by competition among three groupings: rightists, who supported the royal government and alignment with the West; neutralists, who sought to keep Laos out of Cold War conflicts; and the Pathet Lao, who advocated revolutionary change and alliance with Hanoi. In 1957, the Royal Lao government and the Pathet Lao signed the Vientiane Agreements, leading to a short-lived coalition government and the nominal integration of some Pathet Lao units into the National Army. Despite this formal integration, Pathet Lao units retained separate command structures and maintained close ties with North Vietnamese advisors who provided training, equipment, and strategic guidance. The coalition was fragile, and it would not survive the pressures that mounted in the following years. In 1958 and 1959, North Vietnamese army units moved into parts of eastern Laos, collaborating with Pathet Lao forces and establishing control over segments of the Laotian Panhandle. These eastern Lao areas became an early part of the inland supply corridor that would later be known throughout the world as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Royal Lao government and its Western backers repeatedly protested North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao violations of Laotian neutrality, but the presence of PAVN forces continued despite diplomatic objections. By 1960, Laos was sliding towards civil war as coups and counter-coups among rightist and neutralist officers destabilized the government in Vientiane. The deteriorating Laotian situation prompted increased interest by the United States, the Soviet Union, and North Vietnam, each power seeing Laos as strategically linked to the Vietnamese conflict and each determined to shape its outcome. The struggle for Laos was no longer merely internal. It had become a front in the broader Cold War. In Cambodia, King Norodom Sihanouk led the government after independence, combining monarchic authority with an increasingly personalist ruling style that brooked little dissent. Following Geneva, Sihanouk considered associating Cambodia with the U.S.-led Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, but ultimately decided to keep Cambodia outside formal military alliances. Instead, Sihanouk adopted a policy of non-alignment, seeking to balance relations with France, the United States, China, and North Vietnam in a delicate diplomatic dance. In 1955, Sihanouk abdicated the throne in favor of his father, but remained the dominant political figure by heading a political movement that won elections and exercised real power. Cambodia joined the United Nations in 1955, reinforcing its international status as an independent state distinct from the former French Union. Sihanouk's government received U.S. economic and military aid in the mid-1950s, but retained diplomatic ties with socialist countries, including the DRV and China. This balancing act allowed Cambodia to maintain a degree of independence that few small nations in the region could match. In 1956, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai visited Phnom Penh, and China and Cambodia began to develop a closer political relationship built on mutual respect and shared wariness of Western interference. Sihanouk and Zhou signed a treaty of friendship and non-aggression in 1960, formalizing cooperative relations and reinforcing Cambodia's ties with Beijing as a counterweight to other regional pressures. Cambodian communist networks during the 1950s remained relatively small and partly underground, with some cadres influenced by or trained alongside Vietnamese communists during the First Indochina War. Khmer Issarak elements, some with Viet Minh ties, were disbanded or integrated into state structures under the Geneva Settlement, limiting open communist activity in Cambodia for a time. Despite formal neutrality, Cambodian territory was occasionally used by Viet Minh and DRV elements for temporary refuge or transit during the late 1950s, though Sihanouk remained vigilant about protecting Cambodian sovereignty. Concerned about both Vietnamese and Thai influence on his kingdom, Sihanouk sought Chinese backing as a counterweight, which had implications for the DRV's access to Cambodian transit routes. In Laos, North Vietnamese planners increasingly viewed the Eastern Panhandle as indispensable for secure infiltration into South Vietnam, especially after South Vietnam tightened coastal and DMZ controls that made other routes more dangerous. The creation of DRV Transportation Group 559 in May 1959, headquartered partly on Laotian soil, formalized Hanoi's reliance on Laos as a logistical corridor for the Southern Revolution. Group 559's early routes passed through remote, sparsely populated parts of Laos near the Vietnamese border, limiting visibility to international observers who rarely ventured into such forbidding terrain. Pathet Lao cooperation provided political cover and local support for Group 559's road building, storage depots, and way stations that dotted the jungle landscape. North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao forces sometimes shared command posts and communications infrastructure along key sections of the emerging trail, creating an integrated network that served both Laotian and Vietnamese revolutionary aims. The DRV framed its presence in Laos as support for Laotian revolutionaries and as necessary for Vietnam's own security and reunification goals. The Royal Lao government and the United States, by contrast, saw North Vietnamese operations in Laos as violations of Laotian neutrality and as an extension of the Vietnamese conflict. ICC reports on Laos noted difficulties in monitoring remote northern and eastern areas, limiting its ability to verify compliance with the withdrawal clauses agreed at Geneva. In 1957 through 1960, as Laos became more unstable, the DRV increased logistical investment along Laotian routes, anticipating future escalation in South Vietnam that would require ever greater flows of men and supplies. Laos's internal fragmentation into royalist, neutralist, and Pathet Lao zones created a patchwork in which North Vietnamese forces could sometimes move with relative freedom. The geopolitical importance of Laos led to renewed international conferences and diplomatic proposals, culminating after 1960 in efforts to restore Laotian neutrality through negotiation. In Cambodia, Sihanouk's emphasis on neutrality and his sensitivity to violations of Cambodian territory led to periodic complaints about Vietnamese or Viet Cong activities, but no sustained counterinsurgency effort emerged in this period. DRI and later NLF documents indicate that Cambodian soil was used in limited ways for rest and liaison before more extensive logistics developed in the 1960s. The 1954 through 1960 developments in Laos, including the Pathet Lao zones, North Vietnamese army presence, and weak central control, directly facilitated North Vietnam's ability to support the southern insurgency. In Cambodia, Sihanouk's balancing between Western and socialist blocs and his insistence on independence created a complex environment that both constrained and, later, partially enabled Vietnamese use of Cambodian territory. By the end of 1960, Laos and Cambodia were formally independent and at least in principle neutral states, yet both were increasingly entangled in the strategic calculations of powers whose interests converged on this troubled corner of Southeast Asia. At the end of 1960, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north and the Republic of Vietnam in the south existed as two separate states, each claiming to represent the entire Vietnamese nation. The Geneva Settlement's promise of unifying elections had never been fulfilled. and the provisional demarcation line at the 17th parallel had hardened into something resembling a permanent border. In Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh remained president and head of state, symbolizing national unity and the revolutionary heritage that had driven the Viet Minh to victory against France. Yet real day-to-day leadership increasingly rested with the Vietnamese Workers' Party Politburo, including figures such as Lê Duẩn, Trung Chin, Pham Van Dong, and Vo Nguyen Giap. The Third National Party Congress, held in September 1960, had endorsed Lê Duẩn as first secretary, marking his emergence as the principal strategist for the revolution's next phase. The Congress defined two main strategic tasks: building socialism in the North and carrying out a people's democratic revolution in the South. These were not separate goals, but intertwined aspects of a single national struggle. The DRV's 1959 Constitution, in force by 1960, codified a socialist state structure with the National Assembly as the highest organ of power and the Government Council as the main executive body. North Vietnam in 1960 retained a single-party system under the Vietnamese Workers' Party with no legal opposition parties and no tolerance for organized dissent. Mass organizations such as the Vietnam General Confederation of Labor, the Ho Chi Minh Communist Youth Union, and the Vietnam Women's Union functioned as transmission belts linking the party state to various social groups, mobilizing citizens for production, defense, and political education. The DRV viewed the North as a base area for the overall Vietnamese Revolution, responsible for providing political guidance, manpower, and material support to comrades struggling in the South. Economically, North Vietnam in 1960 had a predominantly agrarian economy with growing state and cooperative sectors in agriculture and industry. Land reform and subsequent collectivization had transformed much of the rural economy into cooperatives, especially in the densely populated Red River Delta. A CIS study described North Vietnam's economic policy in 1960 as accelerating socialization of industry and trade while relying heavily on aid from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Industrial output remained modest, with light industry and basic manufacturing prioritized, and plans set for significant expansion by 1965. External economic and technical assistance to North Vietnam came mainly from the Soviet Union, China, and other socialist states, providing credits, equipment, and expertise that helped rebuild infrastructure devastated by war. Socially, North Vietnam faced resource shortages and low living standards, but the DRV had made notable gains in literacy, education, and basic health services compared to the colonial era. The state maintained a centrally controlled media and cultural sphere, emphasizing socialist realism and revolutionary themes in art, literature, and public life. In military terms, the People's Army of Vietnam in 1960 consisted of several regular infantry divisions, artillery units, and air defense forces, with large reserves that could be mobilized in wartime. Paivan Doctrine prepared for both conventional defense of the North and support for People's War in the South through training and logistical assistance. By 1960, Transportation Group 559 operated an expanding network of infiltration routes through the Trung Son Range into Laos and towards South Vietnam, the lifeline that would sustain the Southern insurgency for years to come. In December 1960, the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam was formally established with close guidance from Hanoi as a united front organization for anti-Diem forces. The NLF presented itself as an independent Southern movement, but its strategic direction flowed from the party leadership in the North. In the South, President Ngo Dinh Diem remained the central figure of the Republic of Vietnam's political system at the end of 1960. The 1956 Constitution provided for a strong presidency, a unicameral National Assembly, and a judiciary, though in practice, executive power dominated all other branches. Diem's government relied heavily on his family, particularly his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu, and the semi-secret Kung Lao party networks for political control. The Kung Lao maintained cells in the military, civil service, and key social sectors, influencing appointments and promotions and ensuring loyalty to the regime. Formal political parties in the South included the National Revolutionary Movement and related pro-government groups, alongside restricted or marginalized opposition parties that had little room to operate. National Assembly elections held in 1959 produced a legislature dominated by pro-government deputies, with only limited representation of independents and almost no genuine opposition. Laws such as Ordinance No. 6 and Law 1059 gave Diem's government broad authority to detain and try individuals for subversive activities, and by 1960, these security measures had significantly reduced overt communist organization while also alienating many non-communist opponents. South Vietnam's economy in 1960 was primarily agrarian, with rice cultivation dominant in the Mekong Delta and central lowlands, and heavily dependent on American economic aid for both budget support and development projects. U.S. economic assistance funded a substantial portion of the RVN's budget, infrastructure projects, and refugee resettlement programs. Industrial development in the South remained limited, with small-scale manufacturing and services concentrated in Saigon, Cholon, and a few other urban centers. Socially, South Vietnam contained a diverse mix of ethnic and religious communities, including a Buddhist majority and a sizable Catholic minority, reinforced by northern refugees who had arrived after Geneva. The Catholic refugee communities remained a key political base for Diem, particularly in certain rural enclaves and urban neighborhoods where they formed tight-knit communities bound by faith and shared experience. Buddhist institutions were active in religious and social life, but did not yet form a unified national political movement. The security situation in South Vietnam had deteriorated markedly by 1960, with increasing insurgent attacks on local officials, military outposts, and infrastructure. Insurgent activity included ambushes, assassinations of village leaders, and raids on self-defense corps posts across multiple provinces. Estimates suggested insurgent strength in the South had risen to around 10,000 to 15,000 armed fighters by late 1960, a force that was growing more capable with each passing month. The NLF, announced on the 20th of December 1960, presented itself as a broad coalition of communists and non-communist opponents of the Diem regime. Hanoi's leadership viewed the NLF as the main political vehicle for the Southern Revolutionary Movement, though it was publicly described as independent. American intelligence assessments noted that while the Republic of Vietnam controlled major cities and main transport routes, insurgent influence was growing in rural areas where government presence was thin and grievances ran deep. The failed coup attempt on the 11th of November 1960 by South Vietnamese paratroop officers indicated rising discontent within the military and urban elites. Coup leaders criticized Diem's centralization of power, nepotism, and failure to broaden the political system beyond family and party networks. The regime survived the coup, but Diem responded with further arrests and purges, tightening control over the army and narrowing the space for even loyal dissent. American policy at the end of 1960 still backed Diem as the main anti-communist leader, while privately expressing concerns about governance and counterinsurgency effectiveness. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam numbered several 100,000 troops, but faced challenges in mobility, leadership, and tactics suited to the guerrilla war it now confronted. Rural security forces, including the Civil Guard and Self-Defense Corps, were often undertrained and vulnerable to infiltration. Internationally, the DRV was recognized by the Socialist Bloc and some newly decolonized countries, positioning itself within the Soviet Chinese camp. The RVN was recognized by the United States, Western allies, and anti-communist states in Asia, aligning it firmly with the Western Bloc in the Cold War. Laos, to the west of both states, was already a contested arena, providing a developing logistics corridor into South Vietnam. Cambodia under Sihanouk maintained formal neutrality but was increasingly important in regional diplomacy. By the end of 1960, Vietnam remained divided between a socialist North preparing for long-term struggle and a US-backed South facing mounting insurgency and internal political strains. The temporary division envisioned at Geneva had become entrenched, and the forces gathering on both sides of the 17th parallel pointed toward a conflict far greater than anything yet seen. The storm that would engulf Vietnam in the years ahead was already taking shape, its clouds darkening a horizon that stretched across two nations, one people, and a world watching with growing unease.